Welcome to the Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service. In March 1988, Professor Stephen Hawking's groundbreaking book, A Brief History of Time, came out and quickly became a bestseller. In 2018, Louise Hidalgo spoke to Peter Gazzardi, the editor who published it.
I wrote this book because I am very excited about the discoveries that have been made about the universe. My original aim was to write a book that would sell on airport bookstalls. But for that, maybe the publisher should have put a naked woman, rather than me, on the cover.
The story of A Brief History of Time began in the early 1980s. Stephen Hawking by then held one of the most prestigious academic posts in the world, the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics at Cambridge University. He'd been diagnosed when he was 21 with motor neuron disease, or ALS, and confined to a wheelchair a few years later. In the academic world, he was a theoretical physics superstar, but to the outside world, he was only just becoming well known. One day in 1983, a young American publishing editor picked up a copy of the New York Times magazine. On the front cover was a man in a wheelchair. Inside was a profile of this great mind.
This genius, this remarkable intellect trapped in this body, but his mind is soaring, exploring the depths of the universe, questions about the birth of the universe, what happened before the universe was born, what will happen eventually afterwards. So I was very kind of taken by this, and I put it in my knapsack and carried it around for a few days. And as luck would have it, a couple of days later, I was having lunch with a literary agent downtown, and he said, my brother is a physicist in England, and I've sent him a letter and asked him if he would get in touch with Professor Hawking and see if he'd be interested in writing a book. It's just total serendipity.
The editor was Peter Gazzardi, and unknown to him and to the literary agent, Stephen Hawking had already had the idea for just such a book that would make accessible to ordinary people the great fundamental questions of physics, existence, and the universe.
His ambition was that it be very popular, and that's extremely unusual when it comes to a scholar. I mean, scholars advance in their fields by writing books for other scholars. That's how it works. But Stephen knew his mind and was unafraid to buck convention. In fact, I think he loved bucking convention. There was this 100-page manuscript that was sent around when the auction was established, and it was single-spaced and very uneven, but there were stories about himself, funny stories, and self-deprecating, and those were all very good signs.
Bantam Books, who Peter Gazzardi worked for, was a mass-market paperback publisher. By the 1980s, however, it was trying to move into the more prestigious hardback market. Peter's role was to find the right titles. A book by a preeminent physicist with a story like Stephen Hawking's was perfect. Bantam offered a groundbreaking $250,000 advance.
He loved the idea that he could see his book in airports. That particularly resonated with him.
But the contract almost didn't go through, did it? What happened?
When we acquired the book, it was flagged by the lawyers, and they got in touch with the CEO and said, we're concerned about the fact that this author has ALS, and we're paying him quite a bit of money, and what are the chances that he'll be around to deliver the book? The president of the company, this wonderful, dapper gentleman, brilliant and kind of hard-charging, and said to the lawyers, we'll take the risk, let's go ahead. You know, when a book is as successful as this one, it looks inevitable in hindsight, but then when you look more closely, what's fascinating is all the different moments that arose where the thing could have gone badly awry or been derailed completely.
There'd be a few more moments like that. Back then, Stephen Hawking could still use his own voice, though it was hard to understand, Peter Gazzardi says. He could blink and he could move his fingers and use a joystick to move his wheelchair. Your first meeting was in a car park, wasn't it? And his assistant Brian had put him in his wheelchair and put his hand on this joystick. And then what happened set the tone, really, didn't it, for your working relationship for the next few years?
Yes. Brian Witt, Stephen's assistant, shouted over. He said, Peter Gazzardi? And I said, yes, it's me. And he said, that's Professor Hawking. Because by this time, Stephen had done 2 360s with the wheelchair, and it was shooting off towards the entrance to the hotel. So the two of us scrambled after him and finally said, Peter, I'm so honored to be publishing your book. And I just kind of tailed off, and there was this silence. And then Stephen made some sounds, and then Brian said, Professor Hawking would like to know, where's the contract? And I thought to myself, this is how this is going to roll. And of course, it makes perfect sense. I mean, Stephen didn't have energy to waste, and that would be kind of his trademark as we worked together. And it was always, let's make the most of the time we have together. He was very funny, and eventually, when you got to know him, you realized very warm, and you could see it in his eyes. And it must have been part of what kept him alive, just this indomitable drive, this indomitable will.
Peter's job was to make understandable to non-scientists like himself Stephen Hawking's incredible ideas on space and time, how the universe began, how it might end.
I just kept on asking, I'm just not sure what you mean by the spin of a particle, or what actually is a muon, or what is going on at the edge of a black hole. I just kept on over and over and over and over again. And I knew that had to grate at some point, but I knew that he wanted what I wanted, and he was willing to do it, God bless him.
And at the centre of the book was this extraordinary idea, this so-called theory of everything. What was that?
The basic idea is that there are these 2 great theories that explain how things work. One works beautifully well in the world of subatomic particles, of tiny, tiny things, and that's quantum mechanics. And then there's this other theory that works beautifully in the world of massive things, planets and universes, and that has to do with gravitational pull. But these 2 theories do not work well together. They only work in complete isolation. And the kind of holy grail of astrophysics is to come up with a theory into which both fit. And as Stephen said, once we have that grand unified theory, then we will see the face of God.
Then, in 1985, 2 years into the book, disaster struck. On a trip to Geneva, Stephen Hawking became so ill with pneumonia that doctors considered switching off his life support machine. He was only saved by an emergency tracheotomy, which robbed him of his remaining speech. Peter Gazzardi thought the project was over.
But of course, Stephen knew people who were able to help him and work with computers and voice synthesizers that would allow him to scroll down letter by letter the alphabet. And out of his voice synthesizer came good morning. But it was very time-consuming, and only someone like Stephen with that extraordinary will could use it to continue working on his book and, of course, his own work.
A Brief History of Time was finally published at the end of March 1988. You left Bantam after finishing editing the book, but you phoned a colleague at Bantam to find out what was going on, and that's when you realised, didn't you, that this was going to be big.
He told me that he'd been on the phone all day, and the retailers were telling him it's literally melting off the bookshelves. That was just giddy, extraordinary, delightful news.
A Brief History of Time went on to sell more than 9 million copies. It stayed on the bestseller list for almost 4 years and turned Stephen Hawking into a cultural icon.
On the 14th of March 2018, Professor Stephen Hawking died. Peter Gazzardi now works as a freelance book editor in the USA. He was talking to Louise Hidalgo for that edition of the Witness History podcast, first broadcast in 2018.